The golden light of the late afternoon reflected off the glass walls of the luxurious event hall. It was the most anticipated day for everyone, the wedding of Olivia and Lucas. Everything was perfect, from the impeccably arranged white flowers to the soft sound of the piano that filled the air. Guests dressed elegantly walked through the corridors, exchanging smiles and greetings. Lucas's family, known for their high social status, walked with their heads held high, radiating confidence. Among the guests, almost unnoticed, was a simple man. His gray hair was carefully combed, but his clothes, though clean and well-fitted, didn't match the luxury around him. He was John, Olivia's father. His presence didn't draw attention, and his calm, peaceful demeanor gave the impression of someone used to being invisible amidst wealth. Olivia, her eyes shining with joy, walked arm in arm with her father toward the altar. Though radiant, her heart felt a slight pang. She knew how critical Lucas's family could be, especially of her father's simplicity. As they walked down the aisle, she noticed the quick, judgmental glances exchanged by some of the guests. When they reached the altar, John, with a serene smile, handed Olivia's hand to Lucas. He looked at his daughter lovingly, and with a silent gesture of affection, gave a small nod. As he stepped away, he chose a more distant seat, maintaining his discreet posture, almost as if he wanted to disappear into the luxurious backdrop of the wedding. Lucas, however, wasn't blind to what was happening. He was well aware of his parents' critical thoughts and knew that John's modest appearance would not go unnoticed. As the celebration continued, a sense of discomfort settled in the groom's heart. While the guests enjoyed the party, Lucas's parents, Richard and Victoria, watched John from afar. Seated at the main table, their faces showed expressions of superiority and disdain. Victoria, in her beaded gown, whispered softly to her husband, casting disapproving glances toward her father-in-law. "Did you see her father's clothes?" Victoria commented with a mocking smile. "It looks like he picked them out of a thrift store." "It's hard to believe we're at one of the most expensive weddings in the city," Richard chuckled quietly, leaning in closer to his wife. "Yeah, that guy doesn't know what elegance is. He should have prepared better. I wouldn't be surprised if he asked for a favor to help pay for the wedding." Victoria laughed softly, her eyes gleaming with malice. Among the nearby guests, a few overheard the jokes and exchanged silent laughs. The sarcasm grew bolder as Lucas's parents felt more comfortable expressing their opinions. To them, John was nothing more than a simple man who didn't fit with the sophistication of the event, much less their family. As time passed, the air of superiority between them only grew. Every time John moved, Victoria and Richard's eyes followed him, searching for details to criticize. They couldn't understand how someone so simple could be the father of the young woman who was now part of their family. "He's so quiet. Probably the typical submissive man without ambition, just waiting for retirement," Richard remarked, crossing his arms with a look of disdain. Victoria nodded in agreement. "Olivia is a good girl, but honestly she deserved a father more suited to her. She's lucky to be joining our family now. We'll give her a better future." Meanwhile, across the hall, Olivia started to pick up on the atmosphere. She felt Victoria and Richard's eyes on her father, and even without hearing their words, something tightened inside her. There was tension in the air, an uncomfortable sense of judgment weighing on her soul. John, however, remained unfazed, his expression calm, as if he was already used to being underestimated. He smiled at his daughter from a distance, unaware of the whispers. But Lucas, who had been trying to enjoy the moment, noticed something that deeply unsettled him. He saw his parents whispering and laughing amongst themselves and quickly understood the reason. That familiar, thinly veiled contempt he knew so well was now directed at his father-in-law, the man who had raised the woman he loved. A sense of indignation surged within him, but he remained composed. The moment to act was approaching. Meanwhile, Richard and Victoria's laughter and jokes continued, more confident, unaware they were about to be confronted in a way they never expected. The soft music continued to play as the guests chatted excitedly. Lucas, however, could no longer ignore his parents' behavior. He watched every laugh, every look of disdain they threw in John's direction. That feeling of injustice burned inside him, and he knew he had to do something. He couldn't allow the man he respected so much to be humiliated because of his simplicity. At the moment of the toast, when all eyes were on the couple, Lucas took the initiative. He stood up, holding a champagne glass, and with a serene smile, asked for everyone's attention. The guests fell silent, waiting for his speech. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice clear and firm. "Today is a special day, a day of celebration, of love, of the union between two families. I am immensely happy to be here next to the woman I love, Olivia, and to be surrounded by such dear people." The guests applauded, and Olivia, beside him, smiled with shining eyes. But Lucas knew he needed to go further. "Today, in addition to celebrating our wedding, I want to give a special thanks to someone who, with their humility and dedication, shaped the wonderful woman standing beside me. I'm talking about my father-in-law, John." At that moment, all eyes turned to John, who was seated further back, with a shy smile, surprised to be mentioned. Victoria and Richard, who had been relaxed in their chairs, raised their eyebrows, uncomfortable with the direction of the speech. Lucas paused briefly, watching their reactions. "My father-in-law may seem like a simple man," Lucas continued, his voice firm and charismatic. "And indeed he chooses to live modestly because he is a man of values, a man with a big heart. But what many of you may not know, including my own parents," he looked directly at Richard and Victoria, "is that John, besides being a dedicated father and a model of integrity, is also one of the most influential and successful executives in our city." A murmur of surprise began to echo among the guests. Richard and Victoria exchanged glances, astonished, as Lucas went on. "John is the owner of several businesses that many of you know and frequent," Lucas continued, as everyone's attention focused entirely on him. "Businesses that generate hundreds of jobs, that drive the local economy, and that, ironically, are of great importance to our own family." The impact of his words was immediate. Lucas's parents, now pale and speechless, struggled to process what they had just heard. Victoria, who had moments before mocked John's simplicity, now felt a mixture of shame and discomfort. Richard, who had always prided himself on his status, looked down, unable to face his son or the guests. "The true value of a man," Lucas said, his voice filled with emotion, "is not in his clothes and what he owns, but in his character. And I am immensely proud to be part of the family of a man like John." The guests erupted in applause. John, still seated, looked at Lucas with teary eyes. He had never cared to flaunt his wealth or success. For him, what mattered was family, love, and the values he had always carried with him. As the applause echoed through the hall, Victoria and Richard remained silent, completely ashamed of their behavior throughout the event. They could never have imagined that the man they had underestimated was someone with so much power and influence. And more than that, someone who, with his humility, had given them the greatest lesson of their lives. The hall, once filled with laughter and conversations, was now overtaken by a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of applause still echoing as the guests processed the surprising revelation. Lucas stepped down from the small stage where he had made the toast, and all eyes were now on John. The simple man who had gone unnoticed by many was now the center of attention. Victoria, who had always taken pride in her social status, felt her face grow warm. Her body was stiff, and the fake smile she had been wearing had completely vanished. She averted her gaze from John, unable to look at him, while her son's words still echoed in her mind. Richard, on the other hand, remained silent, his hands trembling under the table. The pride he had always had in his own wealth and status now seemed small, almost insignificant, compared to John's silent greatness. The guests, still in shock, began whispering among themselves. Comments of surprise, admiration, and even regret for underestimating the bride's father spread throughout the hall. "Who would have thought he was the owner of that huge conglomerate?" murmured one guest, incredulous. I would never have recognized him. Simple but with more power than anyone here imagined, responded another guest, shaking his head, impressed. Amidst the whispers, John's gaze remained calm. He wasn't seeking recognition or applause, and his tranquil demeanor reflected the peace of someone who knew that a person's true worth went far beyond appearances and possessions. John, with a gentle smile, looked at Lucas and Olivia, who now stood by his side, silently offering their support. Victoria, trying to control the shame growing inside her, turned to Richard, hoping he would say something, but her husband remained still, lost in thought. Finally, she decided to break the awkward silence between them. I think we misjudged Richard, Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. We had no idea. Richard nodded slowly, still speechless. He felt the weight of the mistake they had made, underestimating John based solely on his appearance. More than the wealth, what now shamed him was the prejudice he and Victoria had shown, letting arrogance and pride guide them. As Lucas's parents sank into their discomfort, John rose from his seat. His steps were calm, and he walked quietly to where Victoria and Richard were seated. Every eye in the hall followed his movements. The man they had judged as simple and passive now carried a dignity that no amount of money could buy. When he reached his in-laws' table, John stopped, maintaining his gentle smile. He didn't need harsh words, nor gestures of superiority. His presence in that moment was enough. Richard, Victoria, John said, his voice calm and respectful, don't worry. I hold no grudge. I know that at times we're quick to judge what we don't understand. But what matters is that we learn from it, right? Victoria, visibly emotional, could barely lift her eyes to meet John's. She felt a mixture of regret and gratitude, as if, in some way, this man was granting them a forgiveness they didn't even know if they deserved. John? Richard began, his voice low and full of guilt. We didn't know. We were arrogant. We are ashamed of how we treated you. John, maintaining his serene posture, nodded, accepting the apology without hesitation. What matters is what we do from now on, Richard. It's never too late to change. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, and she finally found the courage to lift her head and look at John. There was no hostility in this man, only an unshakable calm that completely disarmed her. You are a much greater man than any of us imagined, said Victoria, her voice almost a whisper. And we've learned a valuable lesson today. John smiled again with the same simplicity as always. The worth of a person, Victoria, is not in what they own, but in who they are inside. His words echoed not only in the minds of Victoria and Richard, but also in the hearts of everyone present. The impact of that moment, of John's revelation and his demeanor, would not be forgotten anytime soon. After the conversation with John, the atmosphere at the party had completely changed. The initial judgment of many guests had turned into admiration, and the mocking laughter had been replaced by a feeling of respect. John's simplicity was now seen as a symbol of humility and wisdom, and Lucas's parents, who had once boasted about their wealth, found themselves in a state of reflection. Lucas, watching the scene from a distance, felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew he needed to stand up for Olivia's father, but he hadn't expected the truth to be so impactful. Walking over to John, who was now calmly conversing with some of the guests, he smiled gratefully. Thank you for being who you are, John, Lucas said, sincerity in his eyes. You have no idea how much this meant to me and Olivia. John, with his serene smile, simply nodded. Lucas, I did nothing but be myself. The truth always reveals itself at the right time. What matters is that you and Olivia are together, building something beautiful. That's what truly matters. As father-in-law and son-in-law exchanged words of mutual respect, Victoria, still visibly shaken, knew she had to act. She realized that an apology wouldn't be enough to fix what she and Richard had done. So, she approached Olivia, her daughter-in-law, who was chatting with some friends. Olivia, seeing her mother-in-law, noticed the serious expression on her face and immediately understood what was coming. Olivia, can we talk? Victoria asked, her voice reflecting sincerity. Olivia nodded and stepped aside with Victoria to a more private corner. The two stood in silence for a moment before Victoria gathered the courage to speak. "I was wrong, Olivia. Terribly wrong," Victoria began, her voice trembling. "I was blinded by my own pride and arrogance. And in the process, I hurt you and disrespected your father. Nothing I say can undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm deeply sorry." Olivia, who had always maintained a reserved stance in the face of Victoria's subtle criticisms, now saw a different woman before her. A vulnerable woman willing to admit her mistakes. "It wasn't easy growing up as the daughter of a man like my father," Olivia said, her eyes misty. "Not because he wasn't present or wasn't a good father, but because people always judged him by his appearance. He always taught me to value what's in the heart, but dealing with prejudice was never easy." Victoria lowered her head, feeling the weight of Olivia's words. "I understand now," Victoria said, her voice shaky. "I understand how unfair I was. All I can do is ask for your forgiveness and promise that I will try to be a better mother-in-law and mother moving forward." Olivia smiled slightly, a smile that mixed relief with hope. "What's most important, Victoria, is that you're willing to change. Forgiveness is a process, and I believe that, in time, we can build a more genuine relationship." The two women embraced, and that hug symbolized much more than a simple apology. It was the beginning of a new phase, where family ties could finally grow stronger in a genuine way. Meanwhile, Richard, still reflecting on his actions, approached John. He knew that the previous apology wasn't enough. He needed to show that he had truly learned a lesson. "John," Richard began, his voice filled with humility, "I know I've already apologized, but I want to say man to man that I've learned a lot from you today. My whole life I've based everything on appearance, wealth, and status. But you showed me that the true value of a man is in his integrity and the way he treats others. I won't forget that." John smiled, firmly shaking Richard's hand. "We all have something to learn, Richard. The important thing is to recognize our mistakes and move forward trying to be better. That's what really makes a difference." The conversation between the two men ended on a note of respect, and the party, which had once been filled with judgmental looks and hidden laughter, now took on a lighter and more welcoming tone. Lucas and Olivia watched from a distance, feeling that despite all the challenges faced that day, something greater had been achieved: the true union between the two families. As the night went on, and the lights in the hall began to soften, a new chapter was beginning for everyone there. It wasn't just Lucas and Olivia's wedding that was being celebrated. It was the building of a new family relationship, based on respect, forgiveness, and above all, the recognition that a person's worth goes far beyond what can be seen on the surface. The soft glow of the lights shimmered throughout the hall as the night went on, and the sound of music filled the space with a celebratory atmosphere. Lucas and Olivia danced at the center, but the focus now was much more than just their union. It was the reflection of something deeper that had been achieved that night. The renewal of once fragile family ties and the transformation of hearts that once seemed unchangeable. Victoria and Richard, who at the beginning had been consumed by pride, now found themselves changed by the impact of what they had witnessed. John's demeanor, with his serenity and wisdom, had taught them a lesson about the true meaning of dignity and respect. They were no longer the same, and Victoria in particular felt renewed. There was no more room for prejudice or superficiality that had once guided their actions. As Olivia and Lucas twirled on the dance floor, smiling at each other, Olivia's eyes met her father's. John was watching from afar, his smile full of pride. He had raised a strong daughter, full of principles, who had chosen a partner who also valued what truly mattered in life: love and truth. Suddenly, Lucas stopped the dance and asked for the microphone once again. The hall, already accustomed to his eloquent speeches, fell silent in anticipation. "I want to say one more thing before we continue celebrating this special night," Lucas began, holding Olivia's hand lovingly. "Today we've learned a lot about the importance of family, respect, and the value we should truly give to people. Olivia and I are deeply grateful to have all of you here, but more than that, We are happy to have learned a valuable lesson that we will carry with us for the rest of our lives." He paused, looking at his parents, Victoria and Richard, and then at John. "No matter how much time passes or how simple a person may seem in the eyes of others, what defines true greatness is the heart. And this is something that our family has learned today together. True wealth is not in bank accounts or social status, but in the connections we build and the respect we show to one another." The guests, moved by his words, began to applaud, and Olivia looked at Lucas with an expression of pure love and gratitude. He had spoken for everyone, and the impact of his words resonated in the hearts of each person present. As the applause echoed, John, with his usual modesty, made his way away from the crowd a bit. For him, this was the moment for his children and new family members. However, before he could step away, he felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. Turning around, he saw Victoria, her eyes shining, not with pride or superiority, but with humility and gratitude. "John, please, would you let me dance with you?" she asked with a shy smile. Surprised but always gracious, John accepted. And for the first time that night, John and Victoria danced together. It wasn't a dance marked by pomp or ostentation, but by reconciliation and respect. The guests watched, and the symbolism of that dance was clear to everyone. Forgiveness had taken root between the families, and a new chapter was beginning. At the end of the dance, Victoria leaned in toward John and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me what I should have learned a long time ago." John simply smiled and replied gently, "It's never too late to learn, Victoria." As the night drew to a close, the guests began to say their goodbyes, still talking about the surprising turnaround they had witnessed. The party, which had begun with judgments and superficiality, had turned into a celebration of deep values, character, and redemption. Lucas and Olivia, now officially husband and wife, were radiant, but also calm. They knew they had started their marriage in the best possible way, not just with love between them, but with the true union of their families. In the final moments of the party, when the hall was almost empty, Lucas approached his father, Richard, who was looking into the distance, still lost in thought. "Dad," Lucas called, breaking the silence. Richard turned slowly, with a more serene look than ever. He was no longer the proud man who had arrived at the party. "Son, I'm so proud of you. Today you showed me that the true value of a man isn't in his fortune, but in his character. I promise you that from now on, I'll try to be a better man, a better father." Lucas smiled and hugged his father. It was everything he had hoped to hear. By the end of that night, everyone had learned something. John, with his simplicity, had earned everyone's respect without ever flaunting his wealth. Victoria and Richard, with their transformed attitudes, vowed to be more humble and genuine. And Olivia and Lucas, now closer than ever, knew that the love they would build together would be grounded in values that transcend any material wealth.